Okay, so what I'm going to do, and I'm sorry I had to move locations because someone is mowing the lawn outside. Um, so I'm in a different room, but I'm going to continue on with flavors of reliability and validity. So when we talk about validity, there are these different aspects, construct validity, face validity, content validity, criterion validity. And then with reliability, we have systematic error, test, retest reliability, and internal consistency. So we'll talk about each in turn. Construct validity deals with the property of a measure to actually measure the construct it's designed to measure. That's a very poorly worded sentence, but the idea of construct validity is, does your empirical construct measure your theoretical construct? How well does it do a job of that? So a ruler has high construct validity for measuring height. Or please rate the degree to which you like broccoli on a scale of -10, which means like dislike broccoli, to +10. That means I like broccoli. That has a low construct validity for measuring height. Okay. But of course, a ruler has a low construct validity for measuring broccoli preferences, and a scale item about how much you like broccoli has low contract validity for measuring height. I think that I miswrote that last slide there, but let me just talk about this for a second. Often the things that we use to measure our theoretical constructs sometimes are a little bit different than what you would think would be the obvious thing. It might be possible that, broccoli, if it makes you tall, people that eat more broccoli might be taller. So it might be an appropriate measure of the theoretical construct. Um, but, and this goes into another kind of validity, face validity, like, how well at face value does your, empirical construct measure your theoretical construct? And that's what we're talking about next. This is the notion that a measure should superficially appear to test what it's designed to test. Okay? So, what about socioeconomic status? That's something that's really hard to define because it is a sort of a conglomeration of a bunch of things. It could have to do with your education, your family background, your job that you have. So you'd think that, last year's income would be a really high face validity for measuring economic status. But the problem is that, people go through periods of where they might have a job and they might go through a period of unemployment, and it might look like they, have or from a low socioeconomic status, but it really was just that they were unemployed for 4 months of a particular year, and that's, artificially depressing what their salary is. More a better measure is educational attainment of your parents. It has low face validity for measuring social class, but it's actually a better measure than yearly income for this nebulous concept of socioeconomic status. Because often, if your parents have achieved education, you're likely to have also achieved education. And so it ends up being that when we ask people for, and we're trying to measure socioeconomic status, we less rely on income and we more rely on the educational attainment of one's parents, because that tends to correlate much more strongly with other measures that are important for looking at socioeconomic status. But face validity has maybe not an important topic in an experimental sense, but in communicating your findings, you want your measures of your independent and dependent variables to look like they measure the constructs that you're interested in tapping into. So that's why face validity is an important one to keep in mind. Content validity deals with the idea that a measure should sample the range of behaviors that's represented by a theoretical construct. So let's use vocabulary as an example. One can measure a child's vocabulary size by, giving them a test that they have to define a bunch of words. Maybe it's 25 words that they have to define. Um, or you could show them pictures of objects like a garage or, a bird or a tractor, and see if they'll produce the word that corresponds to that object. Or you could measure the kid talking to their parents and look at how many unique words are used by a kid in a 30-minute period in talking to their parents. Um, you know, the problem is that, all of those have problems with content validity. You know, if I give you a test, you're only being asked the items that are actually on that specific test. So it may be that a child knows a lot more words, but just not the 25 words that you chose to use on that test. You know, if you're measuring the child talking to a parent, you're only getting the particular conversation that the parent's having with the child for that 25 or 30-minute period. So there's lots of words the kid knows that aren't being used during that period of time. So, you know, um, but a particularly bad idea would be to, if you go to, a 6-year-old and just give them 5 words to, if they know, like cat, dog, bird, mom, bottle. That would have low content validity because it's only measuring a small range of the words that a child would potentially know. So, but so content validity is that you want to have an empirical construct that measures the breadth of the theoretical construct that you're trying to measure. This goes back to when I was talking about memory. That 2-hour battery of that part of the IQ test is going to have much better content validity than just a digit span test. Criterion validity is the idea that a test should correlate with other measures of the same theoretical construct. So SAT and the GPA that you have in college both measure sort of an academic aptitude. Okay. So you would expect that they would be correlated. If they're not correlated, then what are they measuring? They're certainly not measuring the same theoretical construct if they're coming up with, wildly different answers. Now, of course, there are some kids that are good test takers, but they're, slackers in school. So they might have a high SAT, but they have a low GPA. But I would say that the majority of students, if you have a high SAT, you're probably going to have a high GPA. And if you have a low SAT, you're going to have a low GPA. That correlation has been shown in research time and time again. Um, and criterion validity can be sort of divided into two parts. Concurrent validity, that two different kinds of tests that measure the same construct should correlate. So if you take the SAT and I look at your high school GPA, you're doing that basically at the same time. But then predictive validity is the ability of a measure of current performance to predict future performance. So let's say that I measure your IQ at age 6 and then I measure it again at age 12. You would expect that the value that you got at age 6 and at age 12 are going to be very similar. It turns out that with kids, it's not the case. With adults, it is that, if you test people at age 30, then test them at age 40, their IQ generally remains within a 10-point sort of band. But with kids, it has low predictive validity. But you'd also expect something like high school GPA and college GPA. Those are taken 4 years apart to be highly correlated. And those usually are, not perfectly, but it is one thing that does correlate pretty strongly. Now, another kind of threat to reliability is called systematic error or bias. That's measurement that's associated with a consistent error across all measurements. Okay, so if you measure the weight of people in a class in kilograms but report the weight in pounds, you're going to get answers that are consistent but wrong. Now, of course, you can always convert kilograms to pounds. I think that you multiply by something like 2.3, and you can go from one to the other. But if you don't know that, you're making an error, and you're going to be having systematic error. Don't think that this doesn't happen in the real world. There actually was in the 1990s a satellite that we sent to Mars, and it ended up crashing into the surface of the planet because there were two sets of measurements used, those that were used by Europeans and those that were used by the British. And the British used weight in newtons, and it was the Europeans or the Americans used pounds, and they didn't realize it. And so when the rocket thrusted, it misaligned itself, and instead of orbiting the planet Mars, it crashed into the surface. So this kind of threat can happen if you're not careful. This is why when you're doing research, you have to make sure that every I is dotted, every T is crossed, because you don't want this kind of error to enter in and ruin your study. Um, you know, so that's sort of a systematic error, and that can be a threat to reliability. Test retest reliability is really just another name for predictive validity with when we're talking about criterion validity. It's the property of a test to provide the same score over repeated measurements. But this is when you use the same test, not like in the other example where I use the SAT and the GPA. This is that like the SAT taken at one time, should if you take it a couple months later, should provide the same result. Now, we all know that that's not the case. Often kids take the SAT twice or three times because, you tend to do better over the course of time because you get more familiar with the test. You have more time to prepare. You know what to expect if you've taken it one time and then you take it again. So what you're doing is when you take the SAT multiple times is that you're hoping that the test has low test retest reliability and that your initial score was a low one. It could have been that your initial score was an artificially high one, in which case taking it multiple times won't help you. But it does seem to be the case that when you take the SAT multiple times, that scores tend to improve. Now, what about reliability? Reliability, again, is the extent to which, if you measure things multiple times, that you get the same result. Internal consistency refers to the degree to which individual items on a test measure a theoretical construct and whether they correlate. So, if I ask you how happy you are in general, you should expect that it would correlate with strongly how happy you were yesterday, how happy you are today, and how happy you are right this second. So if a measure is internally consistent, it's going to give you the same sort of answer, measuring it over multiple submeasures of a construct. So you want your measures to be consistent in this way. Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about reliability and validity, let's talk about it in terms of some example studies that I'd like to talk about. Okay, and you can pause the video and look at this, and then see how you fare with identifying theoretical empirical constructs, independent variable, dependent variable, and threats to validity and threats to reliability. Okay, so let's imagine that you do a study comparing school achievement in high schoolers, but you measure using students' GPA by the socioeconomic status measured by parental income, so the average income of the neighborhood in which the child lives. Well, what's our theoretical construct? I guess it would be high school achievement, and its relationship to socioeconomic status. Okay. What are your empirical constructs? Well, students' GPA is going to be the empirical construct measuring school achievement, and average income of the neighborhood in which the child lives is going to be the empirical construct for the um, the other variable. Now, which one is independent and which one's dependent? Well, I would imagine that what you're thinking is that it's not school achievement that's influencing socioeconomic status, but rather that the way in which you mapped out the study is that you're interested in how socioeconomic status influences achievement in high school. So in this case, your independent variable would be the socioeconomic status measured by parental income, and your dependent variable is going to be school achievement, using the GPA. Now, think about what it could be some threats to validity. You know, um, one might be, is GPA really the best measure of high school achievement? I mean, there are other things that kids do in high school that go beyond just taking classes. There are after school clubs, there are, sports teams, there's general maturation where you learn things. So, it may not be that GPA is really measuring all of what a kid gets out of high school in terms of their achievement. Okay. I mean, I've known some people that in high school, their greatest achievement was being the star football player, right? Should that be discounted because it's not, represented in a GPA? I don't know. That's something to think about. What about the average income of parents of the neighborhood in which the child lives? Well, you know, um, just because a neighborhood is poor doesn't mean that the schools are bad. It doesn't mean that the child is embedded in a house that is poor. It could be the case that, there's lots of poor people, but, a smaller number of really wealthy people that are living in a particular neighborhood. And that could be a threat to validity, reliability. What about reliability? You know, uh, GPA. I mean, sometimes GPA is affected by, doing poorly one semester. Maybe a kid went through a breakup or went through some mental health or a health crisis. That could affect GPA as being measured. Maybe a kid suffered an illness that they, in their after their first year of high school, and so that's the only data that you have to measure their achievement. So all these things could, threaten reliability. So both of these are good examples of, of a study and a flaw in a study that, should be taken into account. What about the study examining the relationship between violent television, measuring the number of hours of violent television children watched in a 3-day period versus the number of fights between siblings per month, based on parental reports of witnessing fights? Okay, what are your theoretical and empirical constructs? Well, your theoretical construct, one of them would be the violent television, watching violent television. And your other theoretical construct would be whether or not it influences aggression or fighting behavior. Um, what is your empirical construct? The number of hours of violent television that a child watches in a 3-day period. What about for, the number of fights? Well, parental reports of witnessing fights. Okay. So your independent variable here. Again, the independent variable is what you're interested in kind of controlling to see what its effect is on another variable, which is the dependent variable. And here I think that, you're not thinking of the number of fights influencing the amount of violent television that children watch, but rather the amount of violent television that children watch that lead to the number of fights that they get into. So your independent variable here is the number of hours of violent television that children watched, and your dependent variable is parental reports of witnessing fights. What about threats to validity and reliability? Well, what constitutes violent television? There are some cartoons that were produced in the 1940s that are far more violent than, what you might see on television these days. What I think of as violent might be different than what you think of as violent. You might see, someone slap someone on a television and think, oh, that's nothing, that's not violent. Whereas someone shooting someone with a pistol, that might be considered violent. Okay, so what does it mean, violent television? That's threat to validity. Okay, now what about reports of witnessing fights? Parents tend to have selective vision when it comes to their kids. They may, see their kids, engage in violent behavior, and they might just think, oh, that's just rough play. They're horse playing around. Whereas another parent watching that might be horrified and think that that was a really violent, occurrence. Um, so parents are not really good and reliable at reporting, incidents that occur between their children because parents are kind of biased observers, and they tend to look at their children in a more positive light than maybe they should. Um, what about attitudes towards drinking in college, measured by a survey, do you drink alcohol, versus the likelihood of using marijuana, measured by a survey question, have you smoked marijuana in the past 6 months? I'll let you figure out for yourself what the theoretical and empirical constructs are, independent variables, dependent variables, and threats to validity and reliability. I mean, these are kind of obvious ones at this point, but it's very useful to go through examples like this so that you can start identifying outright, what the difference between an independent and dependent variable is, and also threats to validity and reliability, because this is what you need to do when you read studies. You're going to be reading studies that when you do your lit search for your paper, where you need to identify what are the things that threaten validity and reliability that I can improve upon in my study and come up with a better result than what the original authors did. Okay. And just trust me, every study out there has threats to reliability and validity. The author might not tell you outright what they are, but you know that no study is perfect. There is no ideal, completely platonic perfect study. So, but this is what we do as academics is that we read studies, we criticize them, and we come up with better ones. And that's what you're going to be doing as part of this class. So, what we're going to talk about next after this is how people come up with ideas and how you might be able to come up with ideas for what you might want to study in your research project for this course. Okay, so I'll get to that next.